Shalom lekulam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center here in Jerusalem. And I'd like to welcome you all to the latest in this series, this weekly series that we do on a Wednesday in English on Zoom every week for the past year and a half or so. We've been discussing Israeli politics and policy, the Middle East, the Jewish world, history, Zionism, and a whole range of issues that are relevant to the work that we do here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, and that I think are of interest to those people who attend the events that we've been doing. Before I introduce our guest for today, I'll just explain for any newcomers, and I know we have a nice international audience as usual, people from Israel, the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. I'm going to speak to our guest, asking him some questions, having a conversation, and I invite you to submit your questions by writing them in the chat facility at the bottom of your screen, and I'll put some of those questions to our speaker as well. It's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome Tom Gross, formerly Jerusalem correspondent for the London Sunday Telegraph and the New York Daily News, and before that, Prague correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. He's had opinion and commentary articles appearing in a broad range of liberal and conservative publications, ranging from The Guardian to the Wall Street Journal. He's written extensively about human rights issues, including being a major critic of the United Nations for its failure in many instances to promote freedom. And he's conducted various on-stage interviews with many victims of human rights abuse and oppression, including a French hostage of Islamic State, a Nigerian schoolgirl kidnapped by Boko Haram, and the wife of the imprisoned Saudi liberal blogger Raif Badawi. He's also an expert on the way fake news impacts on real news and policymaking. And we'll get to a whole bunch of those issues in our conversation, I think. I should also just say that before I met Tom, I knew Tom through an email, through an email that I received from him many, many years ago. I signed up to a mailing list, which I heartily recommend, where Tom collates a very wide range of articles from across the world about the Middle East, which is really informative. And I know that a number of serious policymakers and other writers are signed up to that list and get a lot of their information from Tom. So, Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for inviting me.
The title of the piece of this event was "A Stronger Israel in a Less Stable World." So our starting assumption is that Israel has got stronger, the world has become less stable, and I want to ask you about both of those things. So let's start with Israel. You've been covering Israel and the Middle East for a very long time. In what way has it become stronger? Is that a result of things Israel's done, or external factors, or a combination?
Well, it's a combination of factors. Let's start with something that Israel didn't invent, which is the internet. If you think about it, before the internet, countries mainly traded with their neighbors, and that was very difficult for Israel because they had hostile neighbors, often with no open borders, or there simply wasn't that much to trade with Israel, the neighboring countries around Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Palestinian territories. Now, the internet got rid of borders, and that combined with the fact that Israel already had a very good infant high-tech sector, partly as a result of army service and military thinking outside the box in the military for Israel. Israel was very well placed to take benefit of this globalization, this internet, and so on. So we have now in Israel, world-leading sectors, not just in technology, in medical technology, in drones, in military technology. Almost all the main internet or high-tech companies have research and development centers. They've opened in Israel, all of them: Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Apple, a lot of them. So that's one reason. Another reason is that the economy was liberated. It started about 20 years ago. You know, as people know, Israel was originally a kind of Zionistic socialism based around the kibbutzim and so on. So in the last couple of decades, Israel has become much more capitalistic. It's opened itself up to the world economy, and Israel has flourished as a result in many companies and many sectors. Then you have, this is in no particular order, then you have the Russian migration. More than 1 million migrants, Jews and one or two others came from the former Soviet Union. And as a general rule, these migrants were very educated people. And they have contributed a lot. It's often not quite admitted by other Israelis how much Jews from the former Soviet Union have contributed. But I could point out, for example, in the United States, where Jews from the former Soviet Union invented WhatsApp. You know, Jan Koum, who left Ukraine because of anti-Semitism when he was 17. They invented Google, Sergey Brin, brought up in Russia. I'm just giving you a couple of examples from America. But in Israel too, all kinds of Soviet Jews have contributed to Israeli economic growth. And then you have diplomatic achievements. And whatever one might think of Benjamin Netanyahu, and he has both his admirers and his detractors, he did a lot during his, 10 years of being prime minister?
We lose track. 12, well, I think 12.
He was prime minister earlier, but then he regained office in 2009 until earlier this year, so maybe 10 and a half years. He really did put Israel on the world stage. So he forged very close relations with countries like Russia, India, many Arab countries, South American countries, Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, there was one day I remember when Netanyahu had a meeting in the White House with the American president, and then he flew directly to Moscow and had a meeting the very same day, one-on-one, with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. I don't think there's a single other leader of the world, not of Britain or France or Germany, who's ever done that. I also know off the record, though it's not a secret because Bibi tells people now he's no longer in office, that Putin used to phone him up about once a week. So in addition to the official phone calls they had, Putin actually sort of bounced ideas off Netanyahu about other issues, nothing to do with Israel or Russia. Then you have India, Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. When he visited Israel, I believe it was the first ever visit by an Indian Prime Minister. It was at the time, the longest single country visit Modi made to any country in the world. It was to Israel. Then you have, of course, the Abraham Accords, which, you know, to remind people, last year in 2020, Israel signed normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and with Sudan. And they have been very successful, maybe the one with Sudan less so, but the other three have been very successful. And only today, the Israeli Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, is in Morocco, where he was given a red carpet welcome. It's the first ever visit by the first ever open visit by an senior Israeli to Morocco. And Israel has signed a defense pact with Morocco. It's the first time Israel has signed a defense pact with any Arab nation. And it's not just significant, it's also significant how public and welcoming the Moroccan government is being. And then there are many examples with the UAE and Bahrain. We won't go into all the details, but because there are too many to elaborate on, but these are quite, you know, in a single year, a lot has been accomplished. I would argue maybe more than was accomplished between Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt in the last couple of decades, those being the other two countries Israel officially has diplomatic relations with. Also under Netanyahu, also before him, but particularly during his time, Israel forged relations with a lot of other Arab countries, which it hasn't officially got diplomatic ties with. So Netanyahu visited Oman. He was welcomed by the Sultan of Oman. And again, significantly, it was broadcast live on the main evening news on Oman. So they were very open about it. And Oman, of course, is also an ally of Iran. Then Netanyahu is strongly rumored to have twice been to Saudi Arabia during his term where he met the Crown Prince. And then there are a number of other connections Israel's got with a number of other Arab and Muslim countries. Only last week, one of the senior Libyan intelligence figure was in Tel Aviv. Yeah. So we have many examples. I could go on, but these are a few examples.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk a bit more, I think, about your own personal experience of being in the room and some of those sort of clandestine meetings that were held with Arab officials in the past. We'll get to that a bit later, but I think it's really useful to have that kind of the rundown that you've just given, because we often tend to those of us either living in Israel or who don't live in Israel but care about Israel tend to sort of look at the problems, right, and look at the conflict with the Palestinians, the ongoing conflict, of course, the unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, at least for the time being, conflict with the Palestinians, and also listen maybe to or read the media about Israel outside, which we'll also get to in our conversation, and we forget just how impressive, really actually outstanding it is that this small country of 9 million people has achieved what it has, especially, as you say, I think increasingly in recent years, both technologically and economically, and now, as you so rightly say, diplomatically. I wonder if, I mean, externally in the Middle East, there's also been things like the Arab Spring, and related to that, the terrible civil war in Syria. Do you think there's also something to be said for the way that Israel has responded, made the right moves amidst the chaos that's going on around it?
Yes, well, I should also say that Israel is stronger not only in and of itself, but in relative terms, because of course everything's relative. I mean, I remember being a little surprised when my father, for example, mentioned growing up in London in the 1950s that they didn't have a fridge at home. And he said, oh no, fridges were only for very rich people. Now today, if you don't have a fridge in Britain, you will be considered, way below the poverty line. I mean, I think everyone has a fridge. So everything's relative. Today, you're very poor if you don't have a fridge. In the 1950s, it was normal not to have a fridge. So coming back to Israel, you also have to look at the wider world and also the Middle East. So you mentioned the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring has had some positive benefits, but it's also seen the disintegration of a number of countries. Libya has essentially disintegrated as a country, Syria up to a point, Iraq up to a point, Yemen up to a point. And there's also insurgencies going on in the Egyptian Sinai, and there are other problems as well. You have problems for the Sunni Arabs, so the Kurds in Iraq have essentially broken away and so on. You have occupations of Syria by Turkish troops, Syrian troops and others. So you have a kind of disintegration elsewhere in the region. Israel has comparatively remained very, very stable in spite of, having had 4 elections in 2 years and various problems. These are absolutely minor problems compared to the problems in Syria or Yemen or Libya.
Right.
Then we have also, in the past, we have the problem of terrorism. Now, Israel still has and faces security threats, no question, and we had a very tragic murder of a young Israeli man by the Western Wall earlier this week by a school teacher, a Palestinian Islamic school teacher. But in general, the amount of terrorism inflicted on Israelis is way down. compared to, certainly compared to the Second Intifada, which I covered as a journalist, but also compared to most of Israeli history. Right. In the meantime, not only in the Middle East, but in Europe and Australia and Canada and elsewhere, America, there have been regular terror attacks, unfortunately, and people may even forget them. I mean, there were major attacks, for example, in Nice, dozens of people killed on the Bastille Day truck, Islamists in a truck. There were big attacks in Paris where dozens of people were killed, in Berlin, in Madrid. There have been attacks in Toronto and Boston and Washington and so on. Right. And then there are more smaller attacks we don't even hear about, almost every week in France and Sweden and so on. People are stabbed in railway stations. So in relative terms, Israel is no longer a particular victim of terrorism compared to many other countries. And I just mentioned Western countries. In sub-Saharan Africa, there are terrible attacks and bombs and so on all the time. Or Britain, for example, only last week, a Syrian-born man tried to blow up a hospital in Liverpool. He blew himself up, but he was prevented from entering the hospital. And then you have, as a result of all this, finally, just today, Australia, the Australian government, announced that Hezbollah was going to be recognized as a terrorist organization. A few days ago, the British government said that Hamas will finally be recognized as a terrorist organization. So you have, in relative terms again, Israel is doing okay, though it obviously gives no one any pleasure that other countries may be doing worse off.
And then also, of course, Israel, I think Israel has become a sought after expert on dealing with Islamist terror, right? Like other countries' intelligence services turn to Israel for advice on these things, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's actually been very close intelligence cooperation for a long time, even when governments officially were being a bit hostile. The intelligence services of countries like Britain and France have always been very close with Israel, and indeed a number of Arab countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia. It's been decades that the Saudis have had fairly close relations with Israeli intelligence.
Interesting.
So it's not Morocco as well, decades. So it's not new, but it's not just intelligence, it's not just counterterrorism, it's things like airport security, it's things like, I can't remember exactly, but I think Israeli companies were hired by the Olympic Games and the World Cup, both in Brazil a few years ago, to take care of security. Someone I know personally, an Israeli who has a private company, was given the contract to do the security for the African Nations Cup, that's football, soccer tournament in Africa. So yes, but it's not only security, it's also things like medical technology, heart valves, cameras that go in people's veins for operations. I mean, Israel's a world leader. It's even a world leader in COVID vaccinations. And other countries, many other countries have looked to the Israeli lead. We see now, I think, Angela Merkel, who is the German Chancellor, although today a new coalition has been formed. But Merkel, about 3 days ago, said, we in Europe have to get third booster jabs against coronavirus. We have to follow the Israeli example on how Israel has brought down its COVID rate through a mass third booster jab in a couple of months ago.
Great. So just to say to people listening, I know some people have already started writing questions. That's great. By all means, submit your questions. I'm not gonna ask them during my conversation. I want to keep my conversation with Tom flowing, and then I promise I'll get to your questions afterwards. Tom, obviously in your long career, you've focused a lot on Israel and the Middle East. You've also written very widely about international issues in general, and the title of this event did promise also addressing the less stable world. Can you tell us, in your view, where is that instability most pronounced, and maybe where is that most relevant for Israel?
Well, let me tell you what I mean by a less stable world. Let's go back a little bit. The Cold War, the kind of post-war order, was stable. It was stable at the cost of freedom for people in Russia and Eastern Europe. It wasn't good if you were the victim of one of the proxy wars between the Soviets and the West, you know, in Vietnam or Cambodia or somewhere. But at least for the West, it was stable because you had two big superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and you had a basic nuclear kind of equivalency with mutually assured destruction, which actually kept the peace. You also had America very assertive in the world. Now, since the end, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, of communism in most countries, we're now 30 years on, you've had the fragmentation of large states. The Soviet Union broke up into 15 states. Yugoslavia broke up into about 6 or 7 states, and you had a war, unfortunately, in Yugoslavia with a couple of 100,000 dead. Other countries broke up without war, like Czechoslovakia and so on. So you have more countries in the world. You have America being a little bit less certain of itself for all kinds of reasons. You have China, which is fast growing, and I think it has just overtaken America as the world's largest economy a few days ago, is what I understand. So the whole world is much more, there are many, many more countries there. There are also terrorist groups that don't ally themselves with any one country like ISIS. You then have also breakdown in borders through mass migration. Now, in a way, mass migration can be a good thing for countries, but it can also be a destabilizing factor. So, for example, in recent weeks, you've had migration from Belarus into Poland and Lithuania and Latvia. And in fact, it's a sign of the weakness of the European Union and the United States and the West, that the dictator of Belarus has used migration. You know, he's flown in people from Iraq and Syria and other countries and then pushed them across the border into the EU as a deliberate method of destabilizing the EU. And the West is somewhat powerless to stand up to it. Then you have also general instability for everybody. You have, you know, artificial intelligence, which is spreading so quickly, and it's really going to change the world. So you have, you know, uncertainty in the job market. You have uncertainty, to answer your question, for Israel, also in the future of warfare. So what I understand is that artificial intelligence runs fighter jets that outperform even the best trained pilots, and China is far ahead of any other country in artificial intelligence. So in other words, a Chinese air force powered only by robots could wipe out any traditional air force at the present time. Obviously, America and other countries are working as hard as they can to catch up. But this is a very disturbing, unnerving, uncertain development for everybody. You know, I don't follow AI that closely, but I also read about chess, okay? So now a chess computer can think at least 100 moves ahead, which is far more than a human can. So if say, a computer can play, let's say, 10 million chess games simultaneously in, say, 15 seconds, and then you put that technology into other things, humans cannot possibly keep up, and the robots start to have a life of their own. This isn't the stuff of science fiction, it's really there, and it's a question of which countries, China or other, are going to essentially program the robots.
Huh. It's when you this sort of dystopia that you're painting, it's a good excuse for me to mention a fascinating part of your biography, which is that your godmother, I believe, was George Orwell's widow, Sonia Orwell, who you were close to. So maybe we can, just as an aside, what do you think George Orwell, who obviously wrote the classic dystopian novel, 1984, what would he make of today's situation with big tech? I'm also thinking of the surveillance that's now going on, especially in China and places, when we think of Big Brother as the sort of original ubiquitous, all-seeing surveillance figure.
Yes, that's right. I was very close to my godmother growing up. Obviously, Orwell had died some time before, but we spoke a lot about Orwell as a teenager and so on. I mean, I think George Orwell would be, staggered, as we all are, because the surveillance today is as big as anything witnessed in 1984. It's not just in China. I mean, every phone call in the world, every text message, even when we have our phones turned off, is probably not private anymore. And this isn't just in the hands of governments. Private individuals can buy the technology. There almost is no privacy anymore. The ability to survey people is frightening. I mean, also in Britain, for example, there are cameras everywhere. And not just that, even on a simple level, like if you want to take the London Underground, the subway, the metro, you can't pay cash anymore. You have to use an electronic card, or either a bank card, or you fill up something called an Oyster card, and that is electronically surveying, keeping a record of everywhere you entered and exited with a timestamp. There is no privacy. You can't say, I'm popping out and I don't want anyone to know where I'm going. I don't want my wife to know, or my husband, or whatever. I'm going to pop on the bus or whatever. That's over. Okay, there are cameras everywhere. So I think Orwell would be concerned because of the political risks this involves for dictators, or rather for democracies to become more dictatorial. And we've seen during the last 2 years of the COVID-19 crisis, governments, on the one hand, having to try to stop the pandemic spreading. On the other hand, many governments have clamped down on civil liberties in all kinds of ways. So Israel, for example, closed its international airport and land borders for a couple of months. It was earlier this year, yes, 2021, in late January until late March. They basically closed the borders. Even they let a few people in and out, even to Israeli citizens. Australia and New Zealand have made it incredibly difficult for their own citizens, never mind foreigners, to visit. I have an Australian friend. Her father unfortunately passed away. She wasn't able to visit him while he was sick and dying. She wasn't able to go to the funeral. And only just now, more than a year later, is she planning to make a visit to go to his graveside. And I'm just giving you one example, but there are thousands or tens of thousands of people who have had similar stories, close families kept apart. Then you have, these vaccine mandates. I mean, I myself am very divided. On the one hand, I see the necessity for governments to use some kind of coercive measures to try and keep the pandemic from spreading. On the other hand, several European democracies are about to basically make it illegal not to be vaccinated. And in Austria, they announced on February 1st, people will get a fine of several thousand euros as a first step if they're not vaccinated. In the Czech Republic, where they had today a record number of people testing positive, Czech Republic's a small country of about 10 million people, which is roughly the same size of Israel as 9 million people. Today, 25,000 people in the Czech Republic tested positive for coronavirus. Oh, sorry, that was the figure given today for yesterday. So 25,000 in a country the size of the Czech Republic is the equivalent of about 175,000 people testing positive in Britain or France. Now, the Czech Republic wants to make it mandatory for doctors and other public officials to get vaccinated. And the head of police in the Czech Republic yesterday said, we can't do it because out of the 50,000 police officers, 10,000 are refusing to get vaccinated, and he thinks they'll quit the force. So he said, I can't afford to lose 10,000 police officers. So, firemen, it's unbelievable. Last week in Florida, there was a conference, an anti-vax conference, mainly of doctors who are anti-vaxxers. At least 7 caught coronavirus at this anti-vax conference. And one of them, even gravely ill, today said, he went on about conspiracy theories. And this is a doctor saying it. So on the other hand, going back to your Orwellian question, what we've seen is governments try to exert control in a way that they couldn't before. So it's easier for countries like Australia, New Zealand, Israel, also Britain made it very hard to enter the UK from certain countries. America closed itself off to Europeans. I mean, this was, there was a time in the corona pandemic where I think in Israel, people weren't allowed more than 500 meters from their home, except for special reasons. I mean, this was just unthought. No, 2 years ago, we couldn't have imagined this. So the danger is that once governments and democracies have done this at all, they might do it for other reasons. Maybe there'll be a flu outbreak. Who knows what reasons they can do it for? And today, with the technology, they can spy on people and so on. So it's dangerous.
Right. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind when you're talking about the conspiracy theories and anti-vax is that, of course, the other big element of 1984 is that it depicts a society where there's no such thing as objective truth anymore. That the truth is controlled. That what is true is what the state says it is. And we're also living in this kind of, not exactly like that, but in a situation where competing tribes of left and right, shall we say, are determining what is true according to their own sort of dogmatic understanding of the world, not objective truth. I don't want to get too much into it because we have a lot more to cover, but I think that's also an interesting Orwellian reality.
No, it is. I mean, people have their own truths, or as Stephen Colbert, the American comedian, said about Trump, he said he's going truthiness. He called it truthiness. So it's like a kind of version of the truth you want to have. And it applies to both sides, both left and right. There are occasions where both sets of views are equally valid, but other occasions where they're just plain wrong. I mean, just a made up fact. And this comes from both sides. And people are increasingly living in their own bubbles on social media and elsewhere, where they're in sounding boards, where they choose like-minded people, they unfriend people that don't agree with them, and they're in sounding, they're in kind of echo chambers.
Echo chambers, yeah.
And we see it as a problem for Israel. So I said that Israel's more stable, and it is. And I would even go further and say that Israel's more popular than it used to be among the general public, which is why you've had big international events like Eurovision, or you have that was in Tel Aviv 2 years ago. You have Miss Universe being held next month in Eilat, in the south of Israel. You have this world's second biggest bicycle tournament, which is the Italian one. It was held for the first time outside of Europe in Tel Aviv. And there are all kinds of pop stars and so on in the last 10 years have given concerts in Israel. However, having said that, there is of course also the BDS movement. But the BDS movement, in my mind, is actually fairly fringe, but it makes a lot of noise in this bubble they're in, getting sometimes hysterical in their demonization of Israel. So, yeah, we have a problem with different tribes.
Yeah, I mean, let's maybe I do want to ask you about your personal involvement in some of those meetings with Arab leaders, but maybe we'll say that to the end, and jump off what you just said to talk about media coverage, because you've been monitoring and analyzing the way that the media covers Israel and the Middle East for a very long time. And what's your assessment of whether things have improved or got worse in terms of bias against Israel, in terms of reporting on Israel, which only gives one side, an anti-Israel side or a hostile to Israel side? Has that got worse, or do you think it's got better, in line with what you just said about Israel's general image improving?
Well, it still can be bad, but it might surprise people that, in my view, it's actually not nearly as bad as it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It seems worse because of the internet. Whenever there's an example, it quickly spreads around through social media and email. But in actuality, it was worse in my view. And I mean, there were, off the top of my head, for example, the Observer, which is a respectable Sunday newspaper in Britain. It's the Sunday edition of The Guardian. They had, I remember in 2001, as a poem of the week. So it wasn't on the foreign pages, it was on the arts pages. Their poem of the week by Tom Paulin, who was an Oxford academic, spoke of the Zionist SS, and it spoke of deliberately gunning down children for sport. I mean, I don't think you would see that today in The Guardian. They'd be too careful, if only because lots of people will jump on them very quickly. Another example I remember is The Economist, which is again a very respected magazine. It's the magazine that, for example, Bill Clinton's and Barack Obama say they read. It referred to, for example, Ariel Sharon and Shimon Peres as a pair of artful dodgers. Artful dodgers, of course, is an anti-Semitic character, Fagin, from Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. And then you had, had many other examples and cartoons and stuff, but the internet hadn't really taken off. So people may be a little bit less aware of it. There's something else, of course. In recent years, you have much less coverage of Israel. It's true that you have some when there was the conflict between Hamas and Israel in May this year. There was a lot of coverage for a few days. But in general, there are far less foreign correspondents based in Jerusalem than there used to be.
Oh, really?
Much fewer. So CNN moved their headquarters for the Middle East 3 or 4 years ago from Jerusalem to Abu Dhabi. Most of the newspapers moved their main Middle East correspondents from Jerusalem to Beirut during the Syrian war because Syria was the biggest story, and they remain in Beirut. So, you have still 1 or 2 organizations which are obsessed with Israel, notably the BBC and New York Times, that still has big bureaus in Jerusalem. But other I'll give you an example from Britain, where I'm from. No other British newspaper, apart from, I think, the Financial Times, has a full staff correspondent in Israel anymore. The Times of London, for example, uses Anshel Pfeffer, who is a writer for Haaretz. He doubles up as their correspondent also for the Times, also for The Economist, and also for the London Jewish Chronicle, as well as writing books and being a reporter for Haaretz. You have the Telegraph and Guardian no longer have full-time correspondents in Jerusalem. This is new. So if you look at a foreign coverage, there's much less coverage, at least political coverage, about Israel and about the Palestinians than there used to be. It might not seem this way because there's a lot of kind of people jumping up and down, rightly so, when somebody passes some motion against Israel at some university in the United States or Canada or Britain, or there's a demonstration against, the Israeli ambassador, which there was at the London School of Economics a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. But none of this is new. It was actually worse before. That's my assessment.
That's interesting. And just, excuse me, it seems like every few years, the Israeli government has some new initiative, and successive governments, it doesn't matter who's prime minister, but like some new initiative to handle the bad, international PR and what's called hasbara. Is that, it's not clear to me that that's made any kind of difference. Do you think it's just a waste of time?
Well, let me put things in context. Most countries historically have had very good people go into their foreign services, or in America, the State Department. So, when I was at university, some quite good, clever friends of mine, I went to Oxford, went into the British Foreign Office, the equivalent of the Foreign Ministry. In Israel, on the other hand, the brightest and best people traditionally went into the Defense Ministry or the intelligence services, not into the Foreign Ministry. So over the years, the Foreign Ministry has not had the same prestige in Israel as the Defense Ministry. So the personnel in the Israeli Foreign Ministry have never been particularly good. That's one reason. Another factor is that there in Israel, because of the coalition system and too many different parties in government, usually the foreign minister has headed a different party than the prime minister. So often the prime minister has had an interest not to make the foreign minister too successful because that guy might grab his job. So in Israel, the foreign ministry has deliberately been kept down somewhat. But then you also have less than efficient spokespeople and ambassadors. You've had some good ones over the years, but you've had some really very poor ones too, not just poor in terms of their speaking abilities or linguistic abilities, but also of their general knowledge. I mean, it's, I don't want to go into details, but I've met a lot of diplomats from Israel and other countries, and it's unbelievable just how ignorant some of them have been. I mean, I've just been staggered at their lack of knowledge. Having said that, I've also met some good ones. But then let me just say something a little bit in their favor. There's a lot of hostility against Israel. It's partly the result of anti-Semitism, either consciously or subconsciously. In the past, it was also the result of a kind of third worldism or anti-Americanism, where people attacked Israel as a proxy for attacking the United States. And it's very difficult for any country to deal with, you know, it's a small country, Israel. Its population has grown, but you know, until recently, it only had a 5 or 6 million population. And before that, when 3 or 4 million in the 1980s or beginning of the 90s, it's extremely difficult for one little country to deal with this onslaught of criticism, you know, whether it's at the United Nations or whether it's in universities or so on. So I'm not sure that it's fair to judge Israeli public relations in the way that you would judge another countries. I mean, it's extremely difficult for any country to deal with this. So in summary, I would say Israel could and should do better, but it's a large extent not Israel's fault. Okay,
that's a really interesting perspective. All right, let's before we get to questions from the audience, I do want to get to your personal involvement in some of these off-the-record meetings that have taken place between Israel and the various Arab states, because I know that you've been in the room when Israeli government officials have met with the officials of Arab states with which Israel was not then, and perhaps is still not now in some cases, in diplomatic relations. So how much, obviously, you probably won't be able to tell us everything, but how much can you tell us about them, and what are they cause for optimism that we're going to see more normalization along the lines of the Abraham Accords? It's going to grow, it's going to snowball. What can you tell us about that?
Well, they were strictly off the record, so I'm not going to go into any details.
Sure.
But what I will say more generally is I have been somewhat pessimistic about a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I have long been optimistic about Israel enjoying relatively good relations with most Arab countries, and not just countries, but at various meetings I've been to, there haven't just been Arab government officials, there have been academics, some people from think tanks, and so on. And we're talking about people from actually every single Arab country, even countries like Syria, Lebanon, and so on. And I myself have visited Iraq. The hostility among Arab officials or movers and shakers has always been a bit less. Look, they know that I'm Jewish, for example. There were Israelis there, both right-wing and left-wing ones. There've even been some people who live in the West Bank and so on there. They may have disagreed with some things politically, but there was never the kind of hatred that I've actually seen, even as an undergraduate, among some certain students in Britain.
Right.
I've witnessed in places, you know, among certain settings, even in New York, when I live in New York, or in Paris and so on. So obviously there is some hatred of Israel, and there is some anti-Semitism in the Middle East among Arabs and Iranians, no question. But it certainly didn't surprise me that there were a number of peace accords last year. And indeed, I'd say when Donald Trump said he has about 15 Arab countries they're in he was in various stages of negotiations with about his administration, about 15 Arab countries. I'm sure he was correct, okay? And whatever one thinks about Trump, and I don't want to get into a conversation about him,
good idea.
Specifically on the question of Middle East peacemaking, it is in a way a tragedy that he wasn't re-elected, because there was a momentum which has completely been dropped, I know, by a lot of people in the State Department under Biden. There was a real momentum, both through carrot and stick, with the White House pushing from behind to a whole host of Arab countries, not just the Saudis. Eventually, Israel will have relations with these countries, but I think it will be delayed for various reasons that I won't go into. It's not just that, I mean, Trump also cajoled people into it. It wasn't just, he cajoled them to making it public, is what I'd say. So, let me give you an example. I don't want to give an example because I don't want to give away any identities of various people who could be harmed in Arab countries for having met with certain Israelis. But I'll give you a separate example that I know from Poland, okay? So as you may recall, recently the Polish government, which is very nationalistic and in some ways anti-Semitic, passed a law which basically stops the restitution of any Jewish property and so on to Holocaust victims in Poland. Now, that same government wanted to pass the law a year earlier. And I know for a fact that Donald Trump personally threatened the Polish Prime Minister and President in no uncertain terms, and they withdrew it. And all I'm trying to say is sometimes being tough works. Whereas by the Biden administration, first of all, it's not very interested in the Middle East. I mean, if you compare to previous administrations where you had visits by John Kerry dozens of times when he was Secretary of State to Israel. Before that, Condoleezza Rice, Republican, dozens of times. They were very, very engaged, very involved, often looking in the wrong direction. And what you had under Trump is he appointed people with no diplomatic experience, but all from the real estate field. You had Jason Greenblatt, who I know, who was the lawyer for the Trump administration, Trump Corporation. You had David Friedman, who he made his ambassador, who also was a lawyer for the bankruptcy lawyer for the Trump Corporation. And you had Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who was also a real estate guy, who'd made $1 billion in real estate. And I met Greenblatt quite early, and they spoke in realistic business-like terms. And this is, I thought, they're going to make deals in a way that John Kerry with Martin Indyk with their wishy-washiness had less chance to do so. So, it may be counterintuitive, but it certainly didn't surprise me. Also, because I'd been present for many years in all kinds of meetings, I knew the ground was ripe to make such deals. And, people also want to back a winner. As Bin Laden said, if there's a weak horse and a strong horse, people back the strong horse. So
especially in the Middle East.
Especially in the Middle East. So as Israel, as we previously discussed, has become stronger, lots of people want to join the party. Today, right. Morocco, they want to join the winner. Even Turkey, Erdogan, who's been very anti-Israeli for the last decade, he's suddenly softened towards Israel because he wants to back a winner. He doesn't want to have two hostile relations. That's my reading of the situation.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. Let's get to some questions from the audience. So you actually mentioned Turkey there. I was going to say there were a couple of questions about it's interesting that it used to be the case, in 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that Israel was at war with the Arab states, and it had these close relations with the two non-Arab states in the region, Turkey and Iran. And now it's almost like flipped, that Israel's working with the Arabs and Iran and Turkey are problematic in different ways. Can you say something about, we had a question about Turkey and a question about Iran. So can you just expand a little on the Turkey point about the possibility of relations improving between Turkey and Israel, and also just give your take on where things are with the Iran question?
Yeah, well, in both the cases of Turkey and Iran, in terms of, I'll leave the nuclear question for a moment, but in terms of relations, of course, it's not Israel's doing. There was a revolution in Iran that brought in a very hostile government in 1949, hostile to the entire West, not just to Israel. And of course, before that, El Al, the Israeli airline, used to fly to Iran, I think even daily at one point, in open, with open flags, open Star of David on the aircraft. With Turkey, there's been a kind of internal struggle between Islamists and secularists in Ataturk, post-Ataturk Turkey. And again, it's not Israel's doing. Erdogan is essentially aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why he's close to Hamas and Qatar. And he's a regional rival to most of the Sunni Arabs. And there's not much Israel can do about it. Having said that, business is business, and Turkey I think they'll soften towards Israel. In terms of the populations are concerned, most Persians, most Iranians are not hostile towards Israelis or Jews at all. My best friend in London is Iranian born. I mean, he's obviously lives in exile. And most Iranians you ever meet are almost philo-Semitic, I would say. With Turks, it depends which Turks. Kurdish Turks are quite sympathetic to Jews. Secular Turks are quite sympathetic to Jews. Islamist Turks, less so. But yes, as you say, it's ironic that on a political level, alliances change. This all happens in history. So right now, Iran and Turkey are more hostile, and many Arab countries are less so. In terms of the Iranian nuclear program, it is obviously the #1 threat facing Israel. And it is very concerning. And I don't want to talk about it in depth because it will be for an entire other hour. But obviously, Israel has been taking measures to try and slow down the program through technological means or sabotage. And it's also been trying for a long time to push the West into taking more stronger action to hold in Iran. But we have the nuclear talks resuming next week, I think, in Vienna. And I understand that the Israeli Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, now says he's open to a revised JCPOA nuclear deal, but one's on much better terms than the one that was negotiated by the Obama administration.
Right. So we had a couple of questions which relate to China. And there was a question but actually two gentlemen named Shmuel Yerushalmi, who talks about China and Russia together, and whether Israel's relations with those two countries contribute to a stronger Israel, a stronger, more stable Israel. And Shmuel Taub, maybe coming from a different direction, asked whether you think Israel will follow the Biden administration in potentially boycotting the Beijing Olympics because of the Uyghur oppression.
Well, Israel has and needs to have good relations with every country it can have good relations with, specifically with Russia. As America, which was, let's say, burned in Iraq, it increasingly has less of an appetite to be involved in the Middle East. Russia is stepping in. You have Russian mercenaries in Libya and Syria. You have the Russian Air Force patrolling over Syria. You have increasing Russian influence in Egypt and Saudi Arabia with the governments there too. So Israel needs to keep a close working relation with Russia, if only to stop Iranian Revolutionary Guards placing missiles in the hands of militia, not just Hezbollah in Lebanon, but in Syria, on Israel's borders. So Israel has very close relations with Russia, built up again by Netanyahu and continued under the Bennett government in Israel, whereby Israel has almost freedom of action to hit Iranian targets in Syria. And of course, the Russians who control the airspace over Syria could easily stop Israel if they wanted to. So, there's an understanding there. And you see that Israel does stuff when Russia wants it to. So, for example, the Israeli government has recently said they will recognize Russia's Sputnik vaccine against the coronavirus. And of course, Putin basically told Bennett to do that when they met in Sochi a couple of weeks ago. And of course, what Russia wants is to say, if Israel says that the Russian vaccine against COVID is, let's call it kosher, then other Western countries will follow too. So that's Russia. As far as China is concerned, China is everywhere globally, more than we realize. It's getting contracts and buying up strategic resources and natural resources all over the world. It also wants to invest in Israel more, but the Trump administration, and I presume also Biden, is pressuring Israel not to. So they were quite angry that Israel signed a deal with the Chinese over the port in Haifa. They were angry that Israel hired Chinese companies to help build the Tel Aviv metro, the subway system, which is currently being constructed in Tel Aviv. I mean, Israel did this because the Chinese are good at building metro systems and they're efficient. And it's taking long enough, but it would take much longer if there wasn't Chinese involvement. On the other hand, the United States is pressuring Israel not to be too close to China, but Israel doesn't have a choice but to have some kinds of relations with China. China is the world's emerging superpower. And I mean, everybody needs to have good relations. Specifically about the question of boycotting the Olympics, I doubt that the Americans will boycott the Olympics. If they do, and there's a mass boycott, yes, I suspect Israel would join in if other Western countries are. Sorry, we're talking about the Winter Olympics. The Winter Olympics are coming up soon in China. Well, you know what? With all due respect to Israeli Winter Olympic athletes, and I should point out there are some very good ice skaters, but in general, it's not a particular sacrifice for a hot country like Israel to boycott the Winter Olympics. So I suspect, I don't think Israel alone would join the United States because they wouldn't want the wrath of Beijing. But if other Western countries are, yes. Interestingly, by the way, with boycotts is just in the last days, quite a lot of countries have started seriously criticizing Qatar, where the World Cup, the soccer World Cup is being held next year. Not next summer, but because of the heat in Qatar, it's being held next November. And it is very hot there. I have been to Qatar, again with a number of Israelis, and met Qatari officials there some years ago, and it is extremely hot. And a number of sports stars as well as journalists are now paying attention, particularly to all the migrants from countries like Bangladesh and Nepal that essentially have been worked to death building soccer stadiums. So you've had dozens, possibly hundreds of people killed. There is an obscene term I heard in the Gulf called body sweeping. It is people who fall off high-rise building sites in Dubai and Qatar at 4 or 5 in the morning, and their bodies are swept away and buried somewhere before, the city comes to life. That's been happening for quite a long time.
Yeah, there's the Qatar World Cup is, I think, it's a lot of it is genuinely built on what seems to be basically slave labor.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. So I want to thank Tom Gross very much for giving us an hour of his time and sharing his insights with us. I recommend that you Google him, read his stuff. For those of you who are not on my mailing list for these events, you can email me, paulg@begincentre.org.il. I've just written that in the chat for anyone that's not on. There were a couple of more questions on China, which we didn't get to. We actually had a very interesting talk about China a couple of weeks ago. All of these events, by the way, including this conversation with Tom just now, are recorded on YouTube, and you can find them on the Begin Center YouTube channel, or you can email me and I can send you a link to specific videos. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you very much, Tom. I wish everyone a Chanukah Sameach, and I will see you all very soon.
One thing, just for the record, we're not related, even though we have the
Oh
same.
Yeah, I should have said that. I should have said that we are not related. It's right. It was in my notes to mention that, but I didn't. Yes, we are not related, except
just to put it on record. Okay.
Maybe a great grandfather somewhere.
Maybe. Okay.
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 Bye bye.
Bye bye.